Colonel David Hackworth is standing in a construction zone somewhere in Vietnam. A bulldozer has just uncovered something. A buried Viet Cong soldier, dead for God knows how long, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, and clutched in his skeletal hands is an AK-47. Hackworth walks over, pulls the rifle out of the mud, works the bolt, 30 rounds still in the magazine. "Watch this," he says. "I'll show you how a real infantry weapon works." He shoulders the rifle and empties the magazine. 30 rounds, perfect function. The weapon had been buried in Vietnamese mud for a year, and it fired like it had been cleaned that morning. This, Hackworth said, was the kind of weapon our soldiers needed and deserved. Not the rifle the Pentagon gave them, not the rifle that jammed when Marines needed it most, the enemy's rifle, the one that just worked. This is the story of the greatest small arms scandal in American military history. The story of how bureaucrats in air-conditioned Washington offices sent troops into combat with rifles that failed them. And how those troops learned, sometimes in the last seconds of their lives, that the enemy's rifle was better. Here's the thing nobody talks about. In the summer of 1967, United States Marines were being found dead with their rifles disassembled beside them, not because they stopped fighting, because their weapons stopped working. Picture it. You're 19 years old. You're in a tree line near the Cambodian border. It's 100 degrees, 100% humidity, and you haven't been dry in 3 weeks. You see muzzle flashes. You pull the trigger. Click. Not a bang, a metallic, hollow click. That sound was the last thing hundreds of Americans ever heard. And while you're frantically trying to clear a jammed casing with a cleaning rod, the guy on the other side, his AK-47 is singing. It's not stopping. It never stops. The rifle that was supposed to save American lives was the M16. It looked like something out of science fiction. Black plastic furniture, lightweight aluminum frame. Compared to the heavy wood and steel M14 it replaced, the M16 felt like a toy. Space age, revolutionary. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara personally championed it. This was going to be the future of infantry combat, the rifle that would win Vietnam. It was a death sentence. Within months of arriving in the country, the M16 started failing catastrophically. The direct impingement system, where hot, dirty propellant gases were vented straight into the bolt carrier to cycle the action, turned the rifle into a carbon-fouled nightmare. Every time you fired, you were coating the inside of your receiver with crud. In the mud and humidity of Vietnam, this happened fast. But here's where it gets criminal. The rifle's designer, a guy named Eugene Stoner, had built what amounted to a Ferrari of combat rifles. Lightweight, accurate, high rate of fire. It worked beautifully with the specific ammunition it was designed for, IMR stick powder. Then, the Army Ordnance Corps, the bureaucratic dinosaurs who thought they knew better, decided to change the ammunition. They switched to Olin ball powder without telling Stoner, without testing it properly, without giving a damn what happened to the guys who'd actually have to use the rifle. Ball powder burned dirtier, produced more fouling, increased the rifle's cyclic rate, which accelerated the carbon buildup. The Ferrari was now running on contaminated fuel, and nobody in Washington cared because admitting the mistake would mean admitting they'd been wrong. So Marines kept dying. The letters started coming home, desperate letters from guys in the bush, begging their families to send civilian cleaning supplies because the Army hadn't even issued proper cleaning kits. Some had been told the M16 was self-cleaning, a lie so catastrophic it bordered on murder. In May 1967, Representative Richard Ickard of Missouri convened a congressional investigation. The Ickard hearings uncovered a scandal that made national headlines. The rifles lacked chrome-plated chambers. They corroded in tropical humidity. The ammunition was fundamentally incompatible with the weapon, and the Army had known about these problems for months while continuing to ship rifles to Vietnam. One letter read into congressional testimony, "The weapon has failed us at crucial moments when we needed firepower most. In one firefight, 60% of the rifles jammed. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles in their hands. 60% failure rate.
Let that sink in. The Congressional report used language you rarely see in official documents. It said the continued use of ball powder ammunition bordered on criminal negligence. Not incompetence, negligence. The kind of word that implies someone should go to prison. But nobody did. The Ordnance Corps brass retired with pensions. The procurement officers who'd signed off on the ball powder change faced no consequences. And in the jungle, Americans kept dying because the enemy had a better rifle. Which brings us to the enemy's rifle.
Mikhail Kalashnikov wasn't a scientist in a lab coat. He was a Soviet tank commander who'd been blown up by the Germans in 1941. He spent months recovering in a hospital, and while he was there, he decided to design a rifle. Not a precision instrument, not a technological marvel, a rifle that a barely literate peasant could pick up and use to defend a village. See, Kalashnikov understood something the Pentagon didn't. In a real fight, precision is a luxury you can't afford. Reliability is survival. The AK-47 is basically a collection of loose parts. In the Western world, we call that bad tolerances. In the jungle, we call that reliability. If a Swiss watch is an M16, the AK is a farm tractor. It doesn't care if it's pretty, it doesn't care if it's elegant, it just wants to work. You could practically throw a handful of Vietnamese silt into the receiver of an AK and the bolt carrier would just crunch through it. The weapon was overgassed, overbuilt, and over-engineered for abuse. The heavy bolt carrier slammed back and forth with enough force to eject spent casings even when the chamber was filthy. The chrome-lined bore resisted corrosion. The tapered 7.62 by 39 mm cartridge popped out of dirty chambers that would have seized an M16 solid. The sound was distinctive. Not the sharp crack of an M16. A deeper, mechanical clack-clack. The sound of that massive bolt carrier doing its job. American troops learned to recognize it instantly. Hearing that sound in the elephant grass meant contact was seconds away. And at night, the AK's tracers burned green. While American tracers were red, the enemy's were this eerie, otherworldly green that would arc out of the darkness like something from a nightmare. Veterans describe it as one of the most visceral memories of the war. Streams of green fire coming at you while your own rifle jammed in your hands. By 1967, the Soviet Union and China were shipping millions of these rifles down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The AK became standard issue for North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong main force units. And when Americans first encountered them at scale during the Battle of Ia Drang in 1965, they realized they had a serious problem. The AK had a 30-round magazine. The M16, 20 rounds. The AK's cyclic rate of 600 rounds per minute was controllable and full auto. The M14's 7.62 NATO kicked like a mule and was practically unusable on full auto. And, most critically, the AK worked every single time. Former Army Specialist Michael Garrity, 25th Infantry Division, put it bluntly. The AK-47 was 600 or 700 rounds a minute. Our M16s were at about the same rate. But in a firefight, you have to gain fire superiority. And when their rifles worked every single time and ours jammed constantly, that superiority disappeared. The psychological impact was devastating. It wasn't just that the enemy had a good rifle. It was that American soldiers knew their own rifle might fail them. That knowledge, that doubt, gets men killed. Want to know how badly the M16 failed? American soldiers started throwing them away and arming themselves with captured AK-47s instead. This wasn't battlefield scavenging. This wasn't collecting war trophies. This was a survival decision. By 1967, if you were Special Forces, MACV SOG, or an infantry unit operating deep in Indian country, you actively hunted for captured Kalashnikovs. Not because you were some kind of rebel, because you wanted to live. The reasons were cold, practical arithmetic. First, the AK simply worked. You could drag it through a river, leave it in the mud, forget to clean it for weeks, and when you pulled the trigger, it fired.
Your M16, that thing needed to be hospital clean or it was a paperweight. Second, ammunition logistics. If you're running recon in Laos or Cambodia, resupply is a prayer and a hope. But 7.62 by 39mm ammunition, that stuff was everywhere. Every enemy cache, every dead NVA soldier, every village. You could keep fighting with a captured AK. With an M16, you were dependent on helicopters that might not come. Third, and this is the part that sounds like a spy novel, auditory deception. MACV SOG teams discovered that firing AK-47s during contact could buy them critical seconds. The enemy would hear that distinctive clack sound and hesitate, thinking they were firing on their own troops. In a close-range jungle ambush, 3 seconds of hesitation meant the difference between breaking contact and dying in place. Lieutenant Lee Chilcote, 1st Cavalry Division, described it this way. All of the troops in the north had AK-47s. They had automatic weapons as good or better than our M16s. When you're facing an enemy where every single rifle works and yours might not, that changes how you fight. John McDonald, 199th Light Infantry Brigade, remembered his first encounter with captured AKs. 2 Green Berets showed up wearing .45 pistols and carrying AK-47s. That was the coolest thing for us grunts. It was my first up-close look at what the enemy was using. And you could see immediately why they preferred it. 30-round magazines, we only had 20. The demand got so widespread that by 1970, General Creighton Abrams had to issue orders requiring all captured enemy weapons to be turned in to division headquarters. The only exception? Specialized reconnaissance units. Translation, even the commanding general knew that for certain missions, the enemy's rifle was superior to ours. American military logistics units started refurbishing captured AK-47s. Fabricating magazines. In some cases, it produced sanitized ammunition for covert operations. Navy SEAL teams documented keeping thousands of rounds of captured AK ammunition for their own use. Think about what that means. The United States military, the most technologically advanced fighting force on the planet, was maintaining supply chains for enemy weapons because our own weapons couldn't be trusted. Captain James Vargas, Company G, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, fought in the Battle of Dai Do in April 1968, one of the bloodiest close-quarters engagements of the war. He started the battle with 123 Marines. By the time they'd fought through the village, he had 41 left. 65% of casualties in a single engagement. And here's what Vargas said about the aftermath. Every trooper had a captured AK-47. Every single one. These weren't troops celebrating a victory and taking souvenirs. These were survivors who just watched their own rifles fail under fire, arming themselves with weapons they knew would work the next time they got hit. That's not a performance review. That's an indictment. The North Vietnamese weren't stupid. They knew they couldn't match American firepower. They couldn't call in airstrikes, couldn't level a grid square with artillery, couldn't bring in gunships. But they had figured something out. If you could get close enough, fast enough, all that American firepower became useless. NVA doctrine called it hugging or grabbing the belt buckle. The idea was simple and brutal. Close with American forces so rapidly that commanders couldn't call in air support without hitting their own troops. Get within 50 meters, and suddenly the technological advantage evaporates. It's just rifle against rifle. And at 50 meters in jungle terrain, the AK-47's lack of long-range precision didn't matter. What mattered was volume of fire and reliability. What mattered was that when you squeezed the trigger, the rifle fired. Not most of the time. Every time. Captured communist tactical documents, translated by U.S. intelligence, revealed sophisticated infantry tactics. They called them AK cells. Maneuver elements armed with assault rifles would flank American positions while machine guns provided suppressive fire. Contrary to the Hollywood stereotype of spray and pray, NVA training manuals emphasized fire discipline, short, controlled bursts of 2 to 3 rounds. These weren't ragtag guerrillas. These were professional soldiers with professional doctrine exploiting every weakness in American equipment. During the Tet Offensive urban fighting in Hughes City, Marines discovered another problem. The AK's 7.62 by 39 millimeter round punched through interior walls, furniture, and light masonry. The M16's 5.56 millimeter round, it would deflect, fragment, or tumble when it hit barriers. In house-to-house combat, that meant NVA soldiers could fire through walls at targets they couldn't even see, while Marines had to expose themselves to get clear shots. The pucker factor, that visceral physical sensation of fear, was tied directly to the sound of AK fire. Veterans describe it as a Pavlovian response. You'd hear that clack-clack in the tree line, and your body would react before your brain caught up. Adrenaline dump. Tunnel vision, the knowledge that someone close enough to kill you had a rifle that worked better than yours.
The M16's catastrophic failures didn't last forever. By late 1967, modifications started addressing the worst problems. The M16A1, with chrome-plated chambers, improved ammunition, forward assist, and actual cleaning kits, proved far more reliable. Soldiers who entered combat in 1968 and later experienced a different weapon than those who'd fought in 1965 to 67. The bugs got fixed. The rifle started working. Eventually, the M16 M4 platform became one of the most successful military rifles ever produced. But here's the thing about trust. It's hard to earn and easy to lose. An entire generation of combat veterans never fully trusted the M16 again. Even today, guys who carried early M16s in Vietnam describe an almost visceral distrust of the platform. The psychological damage outlasted the technical problems by decades. Meanwhile, the AK-47 achieved legendary status. Stories circulated, some true, some exaggerated, about rifles that had been buried for years and still functioned, weapons that had fallen from helicopters into rivers and been recovered months later, still operational. The myth became inseparable from the reality, but the core truth remained. The AK worked under conditions that would disable almost any other rifle. Was the AK-47 perfect? No. The sights were crude. Ergonomics were terrible by Western standards. Accuracy beyond 300 meters was poor. But in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, where most firefights happened inside 150 meters, those limitations didn't matter. What mattered was reliability, and the AK had it in abundance. Lieutenant Colonel Hackworth, the guy from our opening, wrote about the M16 crisis years later. He didn't mince words. This was the kind of weapon our soldiers needed and deserved, not the M16 that had to be hospital clean or it would jam. The AK-47 represented everything a combat rifle should be. Coming from one of the most decorated American soldiers of the war, that's not a casual observation, that's an accusation. The bureaucrats who'd championed the early M16, who'd changed the ammunition without proper testing, who'd sent troops into combat with rifles that failed them, they faced no consequences. They retired with full pensions. Some received medals for their contributions to national defense. The troops who'd carried those rifles? Some came home in body bags because their weapons jammed at the worst possible moment. Others came home with the knowledge that their own government had equipped them with inferior gear while the enemy had the better rifle. That's not a small thing. That's a betrayal. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. The M16 went on to become the longest-serving rifle in U.S. military history. Decades of refinement transformed it into a genuinely reliable weapon. The U.S. military never adopted the AK-47. But ask any Vietnam veteran who fought in 1966 or 1967 which rifle they would have preferred to carry, and the answer is damn near universal. The AK-47 didn't win the Vietnam War. Wars aren't won by rifles alone. Policy, strategy, will, those matter more. But in the jungle, where individual soldiers fought and died, the rifle that worked mattered more than any grand strategic vision. Eugene Stoner, the designer whose rifle had been sabotaged by bureaucratic incompetence, spent the rest of his career refining weapon systems. He never got an apology from the Ordnance Corps. The generals who'd signed off on the ball powder change never acknowledged the catastrophe they'd created. The AK-47 earned its reputation through the simplest possible test. When men's lives depended on it, the rifle fired. The early M16 failed that test, and soldiers remembered. 75 million AK-47s had been produced globally since 1947. The rifle Kalashnikov designed in a Soviet hospital became the most prolific military weapon in human history. It armed revolutions, insurgencies, and armies across 6 continents. Not because it was the most accurate, not because it was the most advanced, because when you pulled the trigger, it worked. That clack-clack sound, the green tracers at night, the weapon American soldiers threw away their issued rifles to carry. Those memories defined a generation's experience of war. And the lesson, the one written in blood in Vietnamese jungles, was simple. You can have all the technological advantage in the world, but if your soldier's rifle doesn't fire when he needs it to, none of it matters. The AK-47 fired. That's why soldiers remembered it. That's why they feared it. And that's why, 50 years later, its reputation endures. Not through propaganda, not through mythology, through the simplest metric any weapon can be judged by. Did it work when it mattered? The answer was yes, every single time.